Okay, well, let's get started because we have a lot to cover and limited time to do it, but that is why we've developed this course to be a 4 series, Crash into 20th century women designers from the 20th to 21st century up until the present. It's called Her Seat at the Table. And the instructors for the course are myself, Alyssa Velasquez, curatorial assistant of decorative design, and I will let Rachel introduce herself to the course.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Delphia. I am the Alan G. and Jane A. Lehman Curator of Decorative Arts and Design at the museum, and we're thrilled to have you here today.
So the scope of this course was really developed in thinking about how to highlight some of the women designers that we have in our collection, which is a big part of our collecting strategy to integrate more female representation, both in our collection and in our galleries. So Her Seat at the Table is really broken up to an overview of the field and then also various contexts in which women are currently designing. So today we're kind of looking at the industry. What is industrial design? What is design? What is craft? What role have women played in all of those various disciplines? What schooling have they been able to attend in order to get the skills and tools necessary? What challenges they might have faced? What various partnerships might they have had to form to become designers, whether that be relational, whether that be through a wife and a husband partnership, or whether that be institutional, or whether it be working within a larger company, all of those relationships. And then session 2 hones in on tables and what is on those said tables. Essentially, that is just the framework of the course, and I'm very excited and thrilled to partake, but also be a student in today's session led by Rachel, setting the scene of industrial design.
Okay, so before we get started, I just wanted to give a little bit of context and scope for the class. So we're talking about women in design, and of course, across history, there have been numerous contexts as well as societal strictures and norms that have determined who is encouraged to perform certain types of creative labor or who's even permitted to pursue these careers. So I just want to acknowledge that what we're sharing is one slice of the pie. And that there are many, many different stories. And we are focusing primarily on stories that occurred in the United States and in Europe in the 20th and 21st centuries. I also wanted to say just a little bit about women as we acknowledge non-binary gender and gender fluidity. I wanted to emphasize that we are talking about self-identifying women in the design arts over the last century. There's still much to be said and learned about non-binary gender and its intersection with design. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Certainly as women have pushed boundaries into design professions, expressions of gender have also been part of that, particularly, for instance, in the 1920s with the idea of the new woman and women affecting more masculine dress and styling. And we have other contexts like in the 1950s. You can see in the center a picture of Harley Earl, the head of design and styling at General Motors, and his quote unquote damsels of design. And of course, although these ladies are working on cars, they could not be more feminine in terms of the way that they are presenting themselves. So just to say that again, this is a story of many stories, and that encompasses numerous narratives. So moving on from there, as Alyssa said, today we are talking about industrial design, designing an industry. And so I thought we would start with talking about design. What is design? And in fact, design is a word that has many definitions. Here are a few that I looked up before class. So design can be a noun. Design can be the drawing or plan produced to show the look and function of an object before it's made, or a functional or aesthetic plan devised by one individual or team for fabrication by another. It can also be the patterning itself. So a design can be, an arrangement of lines or shapes that form pattern or decoration. So you can see kind of a range of perspectives here. One of the threads that I will draw out that's certainly relevant to the way that we'll talk about design and designers in the course today is that design in the industrial design context typically means a conceptualizing of a product by one individual or team and fabrication by another. And this is just to differentiate from, say, a designer maker, somebody who is overseeing the whole process themselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Of course, design is also a verb, and it can be the act of creating the look and feel and function of an object. It can also refer to a much more complex act of creative problem solving. So, to design can be to come up with the whole conception for a product, everything from the way that it functions to the way that it meets the needs of the end user or the consumer. So what are some of the other words that we might use? I mentioned designer makers, and certainly making, crafting, artisanry. These are all words that have been used for long periods of time, often to denote people who, as I said, both conceive of the object and make it. And there are also many, many words for making that that are aligned with a particular skill set, right? So a dressmaker or a seamstress or a potter or a weaver. And there's a lot of complicated history in terms of professional designers, as opposed to some of these more craft specific names. And, I think as design emerged as a professional practice in the 20th century, it was crafted in this capitalist context as a profession, and in trying to professionalize themselves, designers wanted to make a distinction between themselves and, say, craftspeople. So this can lead to kind of a perceived slight towards traditional crafts, right? So traditional crafts might be perceived as old-fashioned or kind of quaint, whereas the designer is a professional. And these terms also often, or the kind of divergence of these terms can also often correlate to women's work and also to the work of makers of color and indigenous makers. So I just want to point out the way that even the words that this profession used to define itself can and have been divisive. So within this field, there are also, for better or for worse, some trends and patterns that we see. Starting in the 19th century in Europe and the US, a number of design education courses or opportunities arose primarily to offer skill sets to middle class or upper class women for work that could be deemed respectable or acceptable. And this type of work often correlated to domestic knowledge. So the culture might deign to allow women to, paint china or be a weaver or be an interior decorator, as opposed to more mechanical work, factory work, which was something that, we know within Victorian society and gender and the prescription of gender roles, that women were not encouraged to go into. And by its very nature, industrial design challenges that, because industrial design is design for production. Nonetheless, to this day, we see the continuation of greater participation of women in some of these fields, ceramics, fiber arts, and decorators. Another trope that we see again and again is the the role of the assisting spouse. So I think many women found opportunity as professional designers alongside their husbands. And so this was both, both a means to a successful career, but also often came with the need to accept that regardless of how much their husbands might praise their skills, that the culture at large would default to recognizing the male, would default to giving the male top billing. So for instance, here we have in the bottom left corner, Charles and Ray Eames, who we will talk about a little bit more. And Charles often said that Ray was the brilliant one in the partnership, but it didn't matter in terms of him becoming really the face of the brand. I'm also showing you on the screen a couple other prominent women. Elsie de Wolfe in the top right corner was the first kind of celebrity superstar interior designer in this country. And Jackie Peters in the middle was the first Black woman to lead a textile design studio in New York in the late 70s. Another bit of context to this whole discussion is the role that women have been cast in for the last century and a half or more as expert consumers. So this role in European culture and American culture has long been gendered as female. And there's kind of an interesting inversion to this argument in that some women were able to get work more easily as designers for, say, housewares, because of this narrow way of thinking that perhaps a woman designer might be able to better intuit what women want. So there are numerous cases of women's earliest success coming in the narrow field of products for women, where it might be harder to break into designing, being permitted to design for all audiences, whereas nobody seemed to question that a man could step up and design for women, or a man could design, for everyone. So modern industrial design in the 20th century really defined itself as a creative role that was in service to both clients, the manufacturers, and the consumers. I'm showing you work by two women here that we'll talk about a little bit more, Belle Cogan and Alanka Karaz, who both succeeded and had very long and prolific careers in this role. One of the things, again, as this profession emerged, because it was a new profession that was trying to carve out a space similar to architecture, but for objects of smaller scale. So architects had long had professional training, professional recognition, a skill set and accreditation that was respected to create buildings. And industrial designers were trying to create the same kind of regulated profession for the design of everything else. So one of the things that became very important to, and as I'm talking about the profession defining itself, it's probably 99% men at the table in these early years in, say, the 1920s and the 1930s. But it was important to the men driving this conversation that, and it was also a kind of exclusionary tactic, that in order to be called an industrial designer, one needed to work across multiple fields. So this was a way of dismissing people who might just design printed textiles or just design dishes or housewares. And it doesn't take much to realize that if women's work is already correlating into specific areas where it's been acceptable to work, then it's going to be harder for them to find their way into acceptance in a profession that's demanding that you have to have worked in at least three totally different areas of design. So in the 1940s, there were two different professional societies that emerged, again, trying to stake out this claim of respectability and and accreditation. So one of them was the Industrial Designers Institute, and the other one was the Society of Industrial Designers. It's not really important to know these names, but just know that there was one group, the one pictured here, the Industrial Designers Institute, which was more egalitarian. So there were many more women in this organization. I say many, and yet you can see this dinner in 1942, and the only woman pictured here is Ms. Belle Cogan, aforementioned successful industrial designer. The founding group of the other organization, however, the Society of Industrial Designers, all of its original 15 members were men. So I also show this picture to demonstrate really how intrepid a lot of these early women designers had to be in order to claim that seat at the table. And, you know, in interviews and in their own writings, many of them describe, you know, how hard it was to carve out that space. And there were certainly some individuals who were accepting, and there were others that never really accepted the women having a seat at the table. So these are very brave and intrepid professionals blazing a trail. So of course, a profession has to train its workforce. And, you know, I mentioned a little bit at the outset, the fact that in the 19th century, there arose a number of craft training programs that were really intended to create job training that was considered to be acceptable for a primarily white female audience. And design education also had a role to play with the settlement of immigrants. So in a number of major American cities, there were settlement houses and social clubs. One of the most famous in the history of design, and particularly ceramics, is a group called the Saturday Evening Girls. This was in Boston, and this is a group, you can see images of the women and an advertisement, and also a bowl on the left here. So this was a group of Italian and Jewish immigrants, and they got together on Saturday evenings, and it was a reading club first. And then there were also opportunities to work in ceramics. And so this wonderful little bowl that you see with the ducks is by a young woman named Lily Shapiro. And this line of pottery was produced by the Paul Revere pottery, and in fact became extremely successful. Is highly collectible, but we're able to identify a number of the individual women who worked on these. There were also movements in the late 19th and the early 20th century to promote the ways that that women were expanding their skills in the craft arts. On the right, you see the official illustrated catalog of art and handicraft from the Women's Building at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. So there was an entire building dedicated to contemporary issues facing women, including the evolution of women's education in the United States, and showcasing their handicraft and manufactures. So you can see that this is there's a way in which these kinds of activities are both creating opportunities for women, but also keeping them pretty squarely in a box. So, you know, celebrating and promoting, but within certain boundaries. So one of the real landmark moments in design education was the founding of the German design school called the Bauhaus. Hopefully this is a name that rings a bell if you've studied design at all. This was a really important moment in Germany. The school was founded in 1919 in the city of Weimar, and it would move 2 times to Dessau and then just outside Berlin before closing in 1933. So it was only open for 14 years. But though short-lived, it was an incredible catalyst for modern design practice. And as a result of the National Socialist Party's rise to power in Germany, many of the faculty and graduates and students of the Bauhaus who were themselves predominantly progressive, many of them were Jewish, many of them fled to other parts of Europe or to the United States, which then led to really a diaspora of young trained designers who were bringing their ways of working and their ways of learning across the world. So some of the things that made the Bauhaus really special was its unification of the arts. So everything from painting to sculpture to photography, weaving, photography, metalwork, and ceramics. There were studios for each of these subjects. And it did accept both male and female students. However, women were almost exclusively channeled into a couple of the studios, particularly, unsurprisingly, based on what we've said before, into the ceramic studio and the fiber studio. And so you're seeing this picture in the upper left-hand corner is the students in the weaving workshop. And you can see this is pretty much an exclusively female group. Now, of course, there were women who excelled at weaving and absolutely loved weaving. People like Günther Stotzel and Annie Albers. Albers ended up in the United States and with her husband Joseph became very acclaimed designers and artists and also educators. This is a picture of Annie at Black Mountain College, where she was teaching after immigrating to the US. And let's see, and then also there were many women working quite successfully, creating incredible work in the ceramic studio. This is Marguerite Friedlander. We'll hear more about her next week. One of the few women to break out of this gendered mold, however, was Marion Brandt. And Brandt not only studied metalwork and really excelled in the medium, but she ultimately became the master of the metalwork department in the school's middle years. And the setup at the Bauhaus was that you had masters and pupils in each, or you had a master and pupils in each studio. And Brandt was the only woman to ever lead the metalwork studio. Alyssa mentioned that we are highlighting our collections in this course. And so both the vases by Friedlander that you saw in the previous slide and these bowls by Brandt can be appreciated in our new galleries at the museum. So in terms of education in the US, we are proud to be in a city that was a leader in this area. So in 1933, 34, a number of students in what was the painting and design department at Carnegie Institute of Technology petitioned to have a new major. So they petitioned the faculty to be able to major in industrial design. And they had actually had some exposure to this subject through Donald Donor, who had been a member of the faculty in the 20s, and then had left to work as an in-house designer at Westinghouse, and then had come back to teach a bit again in the mid-30s. So this is, I think, also really exciting that the students were asking for this. So again, students training in painting, illustration, and art education, which included many women, saw the potential for careers in this field and really wanted to get involved. So on the right-hand side, you're seeing the brochure that announced this, the creation of this new major. So the first class graduated in 1936, and that class included about half women. So you can see some of those young women here on the left, in the left picture at far right, working on this train. This model of a train is Ruth Amrine. And on the right, you see a picture of the professor in silversmith, Peter Muller-Munk, with Maud Bowers. And they are looking at a miniature living room that Maud designed as part of a senior project. So in the first 10 years of the degree program in industrial design at Carnegie Tech, more than half of the graduates were women. So you might think that this would translate into a greater percentage of women in the workforce. And the problem that many of these women discovered was that even though they were accepted in the classroom, they couldn't get jobs. Some of the, those same leading designers who were creating a professional society that required that you worked in all these different areas were just straight out not returning, not responding to women applicants, or hiring them only as single women and pressuring them to leave the workforce, should they get married and want to have children. And so, in fact, and this should not be surprising, but as in a number of careers that women started to explore in the 20th century, some of the most successful women chose to forego children in favor of their careers because it was very difficult, if not impossible, to have both. Just showing you a little bit of the type of work that the students were doing. We saw the train in the last picture. They were designing a luxury train car and outfitting its interiors. Here, this is a beautiful drawing in white Prismacolor on black paper by Ruth Amrine. And in interviews, Maud Bowers, Ruth's classmate, talks about how as part of the curriculum here in the region, the faculty and students would take advantage of our many factories. And so, for instance, they went to visit the Fostoria glass manufacturing facility in Eastern Ohio. And then they came back having seen how glass was made and how it was being, produced on the production line, and they designed glassware. So this is Ruth's sketch for a line of glassware inspired and informed by a trip to Fostoria glass. So throughout the 40s and 50s, the educational opportunities continued to grow for design education in this country. And by 1955, there were really three different types of programs. There were programs that were in art schools, places like the Art Institute of Chicago, the Rhode Island School of Design, or the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan. There were engineering schools, and Carnegie Tech was classified as such. Also Georgia Tech, IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, and Pratt. And then there were also university programs at places like the University of Cincinnati, the University of Illinois, and Syracuse University. And many of these programs continued to enroll women to varying degrees. So as time went on, you had more and more potential workers coming out of these programs. Okay, we are going to just pause for a minute. I'm going to mute myself. So why doesn't everybody just, take a quick stretch? We'll take about 1 minute, and then we will talk about some additional individuals who you might like to know about. So just 1 minute to catch our breath.
And while Rachel is catching her breath, I should just say there is a similar function on this webinar Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. So please feel free, if you have questions throughout the presentation, to type into the Q&A module. We'll be leaving time at the end of the seminar to answer any questions that you may have. So please, if anything piques your interest, feel free to type it into the Q&A.
Thank you all for tuning in via Zoom. This format is wonderful because we know we have people from outside of Pittsburgh who are able to join us, and that's exciting. We also miss being in this space with you and being able to have face-to-face conversations. So do come back for a future crash course when we can be together physically. Okay, so again, following the crash course format, we wanted to now dip in and just highlight some of the remarkable women whose work whose work we might want to know about in the period that we've been discussing. So first up is Alenka Karaz. And Alenka, along with her sister Mariska, were born in Hungary. And they studied there before immigrating to the States. So Alenka had a very long and prolific career. She worked in many different media, from wallpaper to textiles to metalwork to lighting and ceramics. And she also had a particular interest in design for children. So she did a number of nursery interiors and furnishings and toys that were specifically designed for kids. And there was a kind of sense of play that pervaded a lot of her work. So one of the things that Alenka is perhaps best known for are her illustrations. So she was actually quite a gifted illustrator. And this relates to the work that she also did for wallpapers and textiles, because these are essentially graphic design skills. And so you're seeing, as a kind of backdrop behind her, a pattern that was called I'm losing. It has a there you go. It has a great name, Calico Cow. So this was kind of a nostalgic, but also contemporary view of farming life. And this was first used as the backdrop of a cover on the New Yorker in August of 1944. And later it was produced as a printed textile. You can also see on the upper right-hand corner some of the tableware that she did for a company called Pay and Baker. So this is silver plate. Silver plate is not used so much anymore because we have chrome and other metals that can create, shiny tabletop goods. But in the early 20th century, in the period in which Alenka was working, and these were made in the late 20s, early 30s, silver plating was a process that was widely used by a lot of metal manufacturers in New England, particularly companies that had previously made housewares in sterling silver that were very expensive, and now had the capability to produce housewares in cheaper metals, and then use electricity and a bath to plate these in silver, making them much more affordable and more accessible to America's rising middle class. So here is one of Alenka's contributions to that more accessible modern aesthetic. So you can see here another one of her New Yorker covers. This one is actually announcing the 1939 New York World's Fair. And then on the right, we can see some designs that she did for tableware, for dishes, as well as on the bottom, a design for a carpet. This was one of the many products that she did for children. And on the right, another example of some graphic design. This is actually the cover of a catalog, a program for the American Designers Gallery, which was a group of about 15 artists, designers who were showing modern work in New York in the late 20s. And so she not only exhibited with them, but also did the design for the cover. And I think you can see in her work this range that industrial designers were really expected to have. So the fact that she's doing graphics, metalwork, ceramics, even the typeface that she's using in the American Designers Gallery is a hand-drawn typeface. It's not like today where we just pick a typeface on the drop-down menu on the computer. So she has actually even created the letter forms that are used on this document. Okay, moving on to another remarkable woman. This is Maud Bowers-Rice. And you might remember Maud. We saw her a couple of slides ago with Peter Muller-Munk peeking into the living room that she had designed as a student at Carnegie Tech. So she was at Carnegie Tech, now Carnegie Mellon, from 1932 to 1936. And Maud was a Filipino American, and she grew up in the Philippines. She had an older sister who already lived in the States. Her father was an American. And so he really wanted her to go to school here. And so she came kind of sight unseen to Carnegie Tech, and just absolutely fell in love with design. So she was one of the students that signed the petition to please be allowed to major in this subject. And in her final year, Maud designed this beautiful coffee server. So you can see a picture of her holding it on the right, which I love. This was a picture taken in the 80s. And then in the bottom in the middle, you can see a rendering that she did of this as a student. And renderings were really important. These were the tools that designers used to present their concepts. So you not only needed to be able to conceptualize the idea and draw and do mechanical drawings, to document how it would be produced, but you also needed to be able to do these flashy rendering drawings that would make it look real, like it was jumping off at the page. Another step in the process of designing was frequently to make a model. So although the coffee server looks like something that could come out of the factory, this is a one-off. Maud went into the metal workshop at Carnegie Tech with a teacher named Frederick Curator, who was himself a silversmith, but worked with the students to create their ideas in metal. And she talks about how they bent the sheet metal, they soldered this. She then also did the woodworking. And so this is her model of a coffee server. And the museum was very fortunate to connect with the family about a decade ago. And so this object is on loan to us. And if you go see Extraordinary Ordinary Things at the museum, you can find Maud's coffee server. So after graduation, Maud has a, unfortunately, rather typical story in that as a young woman, she worked for several of Pittsburgh's department stores, designing display windows and also some products. And then her husband's work took the family to Milwaukee. And she was actually offered a job with Brooks Stevens, who was Milwaukee's prominent industrial designer. However, Maud had a child with special needs and was not able to continue her career and care for that child at the same time. So we're really thrilled to be able to tell her story at the museum. Moving on, Ray Eames. I mentioned Ray at the beginning in a picture with her husband, Charles. And Ray was born Ray Bernice Alexandra Kaiser, and she was always called Ray by her family. So Ray was a student at Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, and that is where she met Charles, who was then actually teaching in the furniture department. And they fell in love and married, and actually moved out to, eventually ended up moving out to California. And one of their first very influential and famous collaborations is the object you see at the far right. So this is a leg splint. This is also on view at the museum. So this is made out of molded plywood. And this is a process where you take thin sheets of veneer, so very thin pieces of wood, layer them up with glue, and then they have to be somehow pressed against a mold, a curved mold, while that glue dries. And Ray and Charles did this in their apartment using a vacuum bag and a machine that they nicknamed the Kazam machine, because it kind of turned on, the vacuum bag sucks down around the plywood, and kazam, you have this object. So they were very early pioneers in molded plywood together, and these leg splints were actually made in the tens of thousands and sent to the fronts in Europe during World War II. And they replaced metal splints that were much heavier and harder to carry out in the field. So these were actually very, very useful products. After the war, that translated into lines of now ubiquitous and famous molded plywood furniture, like you see at the bottom. So, Ray was a very talented artist in her own right, an equal collaborator, if not the lead, on many of their projects. And Charles always gave deference to her talent, but as I mentioned before, that didn't stop him from dominating the brand and the public imagination. He actually participated in a lecture tour in Pittsburgh. I found an old advertisement for it, which still makes me cringe. And it's just a big picture of Charles Eames with the heading, "Men with Ideas." And there's no sign of Ray. Also in furniture that they made for Herman Miller. Herman Miller chose to promote that with his name as the household name. So some of the early labels for the chairs will say like furniture by Charles Eames for Herman Miller, and the Charles Eames is his, kind of signature made into a logo. This is Belle Cogan, who we saw earlier in that dinner party picture with 15 male designer colleagues. So Belle was born in Russia in 1902, and her family immigrated to Allentown, Pennsylvania when she was 4 years old. She was always interested in art, and then her interest was actually piqued in design when a high school teacher suggested that she take a mechanical drawing class. And she was the only girl in the class, and she absolutely loved it, and she was hooked. So she actually graduated from Bethlehem High School and had a scholarship to go to PAFA, to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. But she decided instead to go to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and she ended up graduating from Pratt. And she also simultaneously had to help her father manage his jewelry store. So she also was affected by the needs of the family, taking care of siblings, as well as helping to run the family business. She was fortunately able to continue her employment during this period, and she got a job with the Quaker Silver Company, which paid for her to take additional training as a silver designer at the Rhode Island School of Design. And so after receiving this additional training in July of 1932, she opened her own design studio, Belle Cogan Associates, on Madison Avenue in New York. And she ended up designing many products for companies like Bausch & Lomb, Bakelite Corporation, Dow Chemical, Federal Glass, Libby Glass, Red Wing Pottery, Reed & Barton, among others. And here is a display of many of Belle's designs. And she made the decision for herself that she was not going to have children, that she was going to devote her life to her career as a businesswoman. She had enough of helping with her siblings and helping with her father's business. So she also recounts many challenges in the field for all of the success she found. She also faced, just outright hostility and discrimination. She talks about receiving mail that would be either erroneously addressed or addressed as a kind of dig to Mr. Belle Cogan, dropping the E from her first name. And she also talked about how sometimes on a new client visit, when she would arrive and they would realize that she was a woman, they would no longer want to work with her. So some of Belle's most famous designs are her dishes for Butenware in New Jersey. This was Butenware did a whole series of melamine dishes in the 50s, and on the left is a drawing for some of those. And then on the right, this is a vegetable server, vegetable dish that is in the museum's collection. Like Alanka's tea set, this is also silver plate. So this is for Reed & Barton. So this is, again, more affordable modernism, trying to cater to rising middle classes in the US. So while some designers like Belle decided to forego or move beyond familial obligations to pursue their careers, others certainly benefited because of them. which is not to discredit their talent at all, but only to say that some of the people that we know the most about today and who were able to succeed were certainly boosted by connections. And so this is Eva or Pipsen Saarinen Swainson. You might recognize her maiden name. She is the daughter of Eliel Saarinen and the younger sister of Eero Saarinen. So she comes from a very famous design family. Her father, Eliel Saarinen, was the designer of the campus and the president of the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan, a very prominent design school. The family basically grew up there and had a beautiful house on the grounds. And her brother, Eero Saarinen, collaborated significantly with Charles and Ray Eames on molded plywood furniture and also fiberglass furniture. So Pipsen met her husband, an architect in Michigan, and he founded a company, and she was basically one of the principal designers. So on the screen, you can see some of the products that she designed. This is a fabulous line of indoor-outdoor furniture called Soul Air that was designed for a Cincinnati furniture company. So this is supposed to be casual indoor-outdoor furniture. At the bottom, a line of glassware that Pipsen designed for the US Glass Company, which was in Tiffin, Ohio. She was also extremely well known for her beautiful textile designs. So on the left, this is a quite large rug called Smoke Rings. This is in the collection of the St. Louis Art Museum. And on the right, this is a textile, another woven textile. This is a curtain or a fragment of a curtain, but this is a pattern that I love. This is called spelunking, which of course the weaving pattern looks a bit like stalagmites and stalactites that one might encounter in a cave. So whereas a designer like Belle Cogan was what we call a consultant, meaning she's working for many different clients, and that's her business model. There were also increasingly opportunities for men and women to work in-house at companies. And one of the great success stories here for women designers was the design department at Montgomery Ward. If you haven't heard of Montgomery Ward, you might think of them as the chief competitor to Sears and Roebuck. This is a 19th century, founded in the 19th century, but very important through much of the 20th century as a major purveyor of mail order goods. So on the right is a woman named Anne Swainson. Anne was a Swedish native who came to the US and worked as a stylist at Chase Copper and Brass. So one of those New England manufacturers that was creating affordable modern metal housewares. And in 1931, she was hired by Montgomery Ward to be the director of the design division. And she hired, by 1935, she was managing more than 30 designers. She hired a lot of young students from the region, including a number of women. And on the left, you see Ellen Birnbaum Manderfield. And she actually had quite a career before working for Swainson at Montgomery Ward. She had designed packaging and labeling, and then radios for a couple of different radio companies, Colonial and Sylvania. And then in 1947, Swainson hired Manderfield in the Bureau of Design. And she designed everything from sewing machines to lawnmowers to workshop tools to kitchen appliances, musical instruments, and more radios during her tenure at Montgomery Ward. So another example of an in-house designer, but a very different model, is Florence Knoll. And Florence Schust Knoll married Hans Knoll, the owner of H.G. Knoll Associates, a furniture company. And in 1946, Florence began managing what was called the planning unit for the company. And this was an interior design planning arm that offered businesses basically help in outfitting the entire office. So Florence Knoll and the Knoll Planning Unit had a huge impact on the entire look and feel of corporate American offices for, for a generation or more. So this is a little hard to read here, but it says, this is part of her promotional literature. The Knoll Planning Unit functions as a design consultant service to the architect. Through the wide scope of its experiences and organization, it simplifies the architect's task and furthers his objectives, by coordinating interiors with the total building plan. Shu, as she was known, Florence Schust Knoll, Shu would coordinate directly with the architects. In this case, Gordon Bunshaft of the prominent architectural firm Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And so you can see, again, the only woman in the room here is Florence Knoll with all of these executives at Connecticut General. And this was a huge corporate office designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, for which the Knoll Planning Unit did all of the interiors from 1950 to 1957. So you can see here, with the addition of its textile lines and some of its classic, its classic furniture models, Knoll and the Knoll Planning Unit really defined the look of the corporate interior. And many of their classics are still managed today, and still produced today, and Knoll remains one of the top office furniture brands worldwide. Jumping back a little bit to some of the additional roles related to design that women were able to very successfully inhabit. One of those was teaching. This is Rowena ReedCostello. Rowena and her husband, Alexander Costello, were actually at Carnegie Tech and were involved in the founding of the Carnegie Tech design program, but they left after not too long and became much better known, and she in particular became much better known as a leader in design education at Pratt in Brooklyn. And so Rowena has a beautiful book called The Elements of Design, and she in particular was in charge of part of the pedagogical approach that was really about organizing shapes and lines and different materials into a kind of coherent three-dimensional whole. So you can see in the picture in the middle, she's looking at a composition with some students, and on the right-hand side, you can see this wire sculpture, which again is inhabiting space. So she pioneered many design exercises, kind of elementary design exercises that are still common, of combining, cubes, spheres, cones, planes, lines, and really getting at the most basic design elements of style and how those came together in design objects. Another very important role for women was both in publishing and in museums. So on the right, I show you Ada Louise Huxtable, who was a force in design and architecture criticism. She worked for the New York Times for many, many years, and really raised the public's awareness of the design of urban environments. And then below her is Jane Fisk Mitarachi. And Jane was the founding editor, and for many years, the editor of Industrial Design magazine. So this was a magazine that was started in 1954 and became a very important publication for a field that was still defining itself. And its editorial team was woman-led. And then on the right, the only lady in the picture at the bottom is Luke Lucille was her given name, but she went by Luke Leetsky. And we'll hear more about her next week from Alyssa. She was a production potter and ceramist, but she was also curator of design at the Akron Art Museum. And in 1947, she organized an exhibition of industrial designs from the region. And so in the top right-hand corner, you can see the catalog from that show. It says off the production line, designed for industry for you. I should say in the picture at the bottom right, she is at Carnegie Tech at a critique of student work because she was involved in the Industrial Design Professional Organization, and our regional chapter included Northeastern Ohio, and so she's at an event and observing student work. So as we move forward in time, of course, we're kind of jumping through with our short amount of time here, the civil rights movement and all the changes that were and weren't wrought in the field of design in the 60s and 70s. But indeed, some of the leaders who came of age in that era, people like Sharon Thompson, pictured here, and Nancy Perkins, recognized that there was still great strides to be made within professional organizations. And in the early 1990s, Thompson and Perkins took advantage of an aspect of the bylaws for the Industrial Designers Society of America that allowed special interest sections to be formed to create a women's section. So you can see in this clipping from their newsletter, it says women's section meets in San Francisco. And in fact, these women's sections have continued to proliferate. Here are some recent pictures from 2017 and 18 of the women in design sections in Chicago and San Francisco. Of course, going forward, there needs to be a much greater focus on intersectionality. Women have made great strides in general within the design profession. And in fact, in many educational programs today, there are design educational programs today, there are more women than men, and more of those women are staying in the workforce, as is a general trend as compared to in the 1930s and 40s. However, people of color and women of color are still severely underrepresented in design professions, making up only a very, very small percentage of practicing industrial designers nationwide. I think there are also some signs of hope, though, in the visibility of women in design nationwide. We have athletes and influencers like Serena Williams and Kim Kardashian, who have created their own design brands and certainly are influencing public opinion about women-led design for women. At the right-hand corner is T. Chang. She is a leader within the Industrial Designers Society of America, and also the co-founder and VP of a company in San Francisco called Crave, which specializes in discrete and luxury sex toys and in trying to define a more sex positive culture. And she and her company have won multiple awards for their design. So with that, we have about 20 minutes left, about 10 minutes left. So as promised, we are happy to take questions in the Q&A box.
Rachel, I had a question. You mentioned throughout your talk affordable modernism with many of the products. I'm wondering, is there a correlation between the proliferation of affordable modernism and the gender that we are currently talking about today? That like women designers were either more incentivized or more personally motivated to create product lines that were affordable to mass markets and consumers.
It's interesting. I think I'm trying to think of a good example without, example without overgeneralizing, right? Because it's also a gender, it's also it's also stereotypical of the female gender to be, say, more invested in cultivation and care, right, of individuals and in making an impact. And I do think that there's a strain of humanism and altruism that runs throughout the core of the industrial design profession, whether or not that was fulfilled and whether or not that desire to make a difference rose above the other endemic challenges with design for mass production in terms of influences on the environment and like ubiquity of maybe things that we don't need and artificial obsolescence. I'm not sure. So I think it's I don't know, I think that's a good subject to probe further, but I don't have an answer.
That's okay. We have another question. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on women designers on the collection at Carnegie Museum of Art and what has been surprising to you as a curator cultivating said collection and also being the spearhead behind our reinstallation of Extraordinary Ordinary Things at Carnegie Museum of Art?
Let's see. I have a couple thoughts on that question. Thank you for the question. I think there is a real challenge in trying to collect design from the past that has been, by individuals who have been overlooked. So, for instance, whereas we were able to get a vegetable server by Belle Cogan, we don't, as of yet, have any work in the collection by Alanka Karaz, and that's not for lack of looking. It's just literally as people in positions like Alyssa and myself try to rectify these past wrongs, our peers are doing this too, and sometimes there's only so many of these things that have survived. Or that are identifiable, right? Because if in the period, things were more valued when they were designed by notable men and maybe more recognized as collectible or noteworthy design, it has a cumulative effect because people value it then, and then they tell their children to value it. And so it becomes more collectible. And so there's this way in which the value that we ascribe to a work at the time that it's made and that correlates often to its maker stays with it. So I think that's one thought that I guess it's somewhat surprising, and it can also just be very disappointing and frustrating, right? Because it's like, here we are, like we want to bring all of this work into the collection and to realize how hard it can be to find some of these things. I think the other thing that I'm really cognizant of and putting together this program today too is for all the success stories, the people that we don't know about, the women who were actually doing the work in a firm, but who never got the credit. They were behind the scenes. And this wasn't just women slated in this way. At many consulting design firms, it was the name on the door that took top billing. So I think there's also a lot of anonymity in our field that's hard to recover, to find the work done that didn't get credit at the time. And so trying to dredge that up. So I guess that's a couple thoughts. We have some more questions coming in.
Yes. Were there any notable Pittsburgh designers? You mentioned Maud Bowers, and we definitely know in the reinstallation of Extraordinary Ordinary Things, we did want to highlight Pittsburgh stories. I guess, are there any specific notable Pittsburgh designers that you would like to call attention to that you might not have throughout today's lecture?
Yeah, I think I would give a shout out to Irene Pasinski. Irene Pasinski-Saylor. She was also a graduate of Carnegie Tech. And she worked in interiors primarily. And so she's somebody who is hard for us to collect because her work was often like the entirety of an interior. She did do some ceramic designs, and we've looked for them, but not been successful. Catherine Walworth, who was with the museum about 7 years ago, when we did Silver to Steel, that is the modern designs of Peter Muller-Munk. Catherine and Katie Clausen did a companion exhibition in our Charity Randall Gallery, where we now have locally sourced, which was called Hot Metal Modern, that looked at other designers that were kind of part of Peter Muller-Munk's circle and included a number of prominent women. So I would say that Irene, you can look up Irene Pasinski and find out about her career. But again, she's been somebody who is difficult to collect. All right, are there any new questions in there, Alyssa? Or?
Thank you. I do not see any more questions. So maybe I will just, Lucy's giving a shout out to those in attendance. You might have some pieces in your home. So maybe turn over some more ceramics and you might find a signature that you didn't know was there before. But I guess I'll just say thank you for everyone being with us for this first session. We'll see you next week. As I said, next week's session will be about specifically ceramics. And so we'll be touching base with some of the individuals that Rachel mentioned throughout the course of her talk today. We'll be getting a deeper dive into some of them and learning a little bit more about the schools of which they attended. We'll be returning to the Bauhaus, and we'll be returning to other stateside schools that were actually set up by individuals who went through the Bauhaus program and then tried to create similar programs in the States. So we look forward to continuing this conversation and highlighting some of these stellar women designers that we have both in our collection and that were prominent in the 20th and 21st century. So, and then we're getting a lot of shout outs in the chat. So in case you haven't seen them, Rachel.
Yes, I'm reading. Thank you everyone for your feedback and for attending.